Hey everyone, welcome to the 4 types of editing every manuscript needs. As an editor myself, I have a lot of clients who, of course, come to me requesting editing. Um, and I think most authors know that their manuscript needs an editor, that that's an important step of the writing process. But I think a lot of authors don't know that there are different types of editing. And if you don't know about those different types, the danger is that you could end up paying for something twice because you may hire 2 different editors who have different ideas of what you need. You might end up um, paying for something that you don't need at all. Or, probably worst case scenario, you could end up not even seeking out the right type of editor for your manuscript. And that would leave your piece not as strong as it could be. So, the purpose of today's course is just to give you an overview of what the different types of editing are that are available, and why you might need each of those types. So we're going to talk about self-editing and the importance of that. We're going to talk about developmental editing, line editing, and proofreading. We're going to talk about what each of those entails and why it's essential to make your manuscript the best that it can be. So the first type of editing that we're going to talk about is self-editing. And I'm going to pick on my newbie authors just a little bit here because this is a common mistake that I see from first-time authors. And that is just not self-editing or not self-editing enough. I think a lot of new authors are just so excited to get through all those steps in the publication process, and they want to hold that book in their hands, and they kind of get in a rush. And so here's what you need to know about self-editing. You should never, ever send a rough draft to an editor. You should, if you've just finished something, it's not ready to go to an editor yet. If you've just finished it, it needs at least 2 careful read-throughs before you do that. And this varies depending on what the type of manuscript is, how long it'll take. For example, if it's a picture book, it's going to be pretty quick. Whereas if it's a novel, a middle grade novel or something, it's going to take a lot longer. I recommend that one of those read-throughs be allowed. Yes, even with a novel, because you'd be amazed at the things that you'll notice when you hear the words spoken instead of just seeing them on the page. This is also where you should utilize your critique partners. So this is where you get them to read and give you their feedback. They don't really have to edit it for you, but just as like a beta reader to give you some general guidance and feedback on what they think. This is also where you should absolutely run some kind of basic editing software. Grammarly is a good one. They all have their weaknesses. They're not going to catch everything, and you shouldn't just make all the changes they suggest, but definitely take the time to go through, and if it has flagged a word that's spelled wrong, make those kinds of corrections. Basically, the point of self-editing is that you want the manuscript that you send to your editor to represent your very, very best work, not just something that you've just finished writing on the paper. You want to take the time to critique it yourself and improve it yourself as much as you possibly can. So I have sort of an analogy that I'm going to carry throughout this entire course about the different stages of editing. So for this analogy, self-editing is like creating the blueprints for your dream house. So if I told you you get to get out a piece of paper and design your dream house down to the very most minute detail, that should be your self-editing process, where you're going to hand this to a contractor to build this house for you. So you want to make sure that you didn't leave anything out and that you have it exactly the way that you want it, that each door opens the right direction, that the layout is right, the measurements are right. You're not just going to slop something down on a napkin and hand it to them. You're going to make sure that you give them your expectations and you have it exactly the way that you want it. That's the self-editing process. So think of yourself as you're responsible for designing your dream home, and you don't want to get it wrong. You want to make sure that you give them as much information as you can so that whenever they go to build it, they're going to get exactly the way you want it. That's self-editing. So after you've self-edited as much as you can and you feel like you've got it as polished as it can be, then your manuscript is going to need developmental editing. The purpose of developmental editing is to improve the big picture. So developmental editor is going to look at plot and theme and pacing and really things that are big pieces of the puzzle. They are not going to be marking punctuation and spelling and things like that, which I think a lot of people are what they typically think of as editing. That's not happening at this stage. Now, a lot of people, I think because it doesn't match that, they picture the red pen marking missing periods and commas and things. But this is actually more important than that. Typos are easy to fix. Developmental editing stuff is not easy, okay? It's complex. It's like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube and get all those pieces to fall into place. So for that reason, a couple things to know. It cannot be done yourself. You have to have an outside view of the story. At this point, after having self-edited multiple times, you are too close to it. You need a second viewpoint. It is also more art than science. And this is really important to keep in mind especially if you're a new author just starting out. It may take you a while to find an editor that matches your vision for your story or that gets you as a writer. Because you will get different feedback from different editors. I mean, if you think about, there's a million different ways a story could go. And so one editor, developmental editor, may see it one way and another may see it totally differently. And so you as the author, it's your story, you own it. So you need to kind of, when you're just starting out, hire several different developmental editors. And then when you find one that gets you, that has that same vision as you do, stick with them going forward. You need to know that this may require multiple rounds. You may need to, this is one of those things where your editor may be able to tell you if it needs another round, or it may be something that you yourself just kind of feel like, you know what, it's not quite there yet. I need them to go through it again. So it may take multiple rounds. And the main thing to know is that this type of editing is going to result in big changes if it's done correctly. So some of those big changes could be things like noticing plot holes, the gaps in the story that don't make sense. They might be able to point out where you need to add a subplot or where a subplot that you've added is distracting and needs to be removed. They might note how certain events contribute to or detract from your theme. They might be able to show you which characters need to be developed more, or where your pacing is too fast or too slow. If you have the kind of story that deals with flashbacks or jumps in time, they're going to be working on that. And if you shift points of view, or if you do that on purpose or accidentally, they're going to be noting that. So, these are the kind of things that when you get this feedback, you may end up cutting a whole character. You may end up adding a character. You may take a whole scene and move it to a different point in the story. So pretty major changes are likely going to come from a developmental edit. And the hardest part for you as an author is probably going to be keeping your mind open to those changes. Because presumably once you found an editor that you like, they're going to be helping, their job is to help strengthen your story. And I can't tell you how many times myself I've gotten feedback from an editor and been like, oh, but I love that character. I love that scene. How could they want to cut it? And then you let it soak in for a week or two, and then you come back to it. And when you try making those changes to see what happens, often you'll find that they were right and it does strengthen the story rather than detract from it. So, with developmental editors, you really have to be open-minded. So back to our house analogy. So if self-editing is you drawing those floor plans and planning each detail of exactly how you want your dream house to look, developmental editing is when you actually get the contractor on site and they start putting up those walls and they put in the plumbing and they put in the electrical and they start to tell you, well, you know what, we need to move the sink here because the plumbing won't run here. Or how many outlets do you want on this wall? Are you sure you really need this outlet here? Maybe we could move it over here. And so it looked great on paper. It looked perfect in your initial design. But when you actually get into the nuts and bolts of building that dream house, an expert, a contractor who does this all the time is going to be able to make things flow a little bit better and make that house truly function the way that you want it to when it's finished. So That's developmental editing, when you take that blueprint, but you make some practical changes as you actually construct it. All right, so after you've done your self-editing and your developmental editing, you get to line editing. Now, I've heard this called line by line, or I think I've even heard it called copy editing once or twice. Whatever you call it, the purpose of this type of editing is to improve sentence structure, flow, and readability. So I've got the magnifying glass on here because we're basically kind of really zooming in on each sentence and paragraph now. Instead of looking at the big puzzle pieces and how they come together, we're looking at each element of the sentence and making sure that it flows line by line. So some things to know about this. First of all, this type of editing is often combined with either developmental editing or proofreading. And that's just kind of the nature of writing. So if I'm a developmental editor and I am focusing as I read on big elements of plot and theme and things like that, I'm also a good reader, so I'm naturally going to notice some areas where maybe a sentence structure is awkward or it doesn't quite flow the way that it should. And I might go ahead and mark that. Same thing with proofreading, which we'll talk about in a bit. But so if I'm looking for commas and spelling mistakes, I'm probably going to get into the flow and structure of sentences as well, because that's, commas and grammar have to do with that. So these overlap quite often. You may find that you don't need to hire a separate line editor. Your developmental editor may cover some of that. For example, in my editing services, I combine line and developmental editing. Those are one service to me because my brain just does them both at the same time. Like I have a hard time separating them, and so I do them together, and that's perfectly fine. It may need multiple rounds. So depending on who you hire, you may hire a developmental editor and a proofreader, and they both kind of do some line editing as they go, and that's perfectly fine. The main thing is that this is much more detail oriented. So these are going to be word choices and things like that. So here's some things that a line editor is going to focus on. If a sentence or a paragraph sounds clunky when you read it aloud, they're going to say, oh, you're showing instead of telling, which is a common thing. They're going to talk about the voice of your characters and your dialogue and whether it sounds authentic. They are going to point out areas of vivid imagery or description or where you need to add those. They may point out, oh, you've said this word 3 times in the paragraph, things like that. So very line level changes. So in our house analogy, line editing is when you put the finishes on your house. So after the contractor has put in the plumbing and the electrical and the walls are up and the drywall is done and the bones of the story are solid, okay, then line editing is the pretty part. It's where you go in and you make each room look, have the look that you want it to. So those line editors are going into each paragraph or each chapter and really artistically polishing the flow of that story. And that's kind of like this stage of a house where you're putting, what kind of tile and what kind of flooring and what kind of handles on the cabinetry and all of that. So it's the pretty part of editing. And last we come to proofreading. So the goal of proofreading is probably what a lot of people envision as the traditional editing, which is correcting errors in spelling, punctuation, and grammar. So this is a totally different skill than the others because it's more science than art. In other words, there's a right and a wrong way to proofread. And so you really need someone who has that eye for detail and that skill with grammar. I always think it's a great idea to get a fresh set of eyes at this stage. So if I had a developmental editor that I had hired who did the developmental and the line editing, for example, I may hire someone else to do the proofreading just because, like I said, it's kind of a different skill set. And I also just think once you become familiar with a story, you kind of overlook some of the little tiny details. So that's just my suggestion. You might even consider paying for more than one proofreader for that exact reason. And that I think is more true if you're self-publishing and we'll get to that in just a second, because if you're self-publishing, all of this falls on you. You're responsible for every single detail of your book. And so you may pay for 2 rounds of proofreading just to make sure you've caught as much as you can. Now, I say as much as you can because you will never catch everything. You can find typos in every single book that's on the shelf at Barnes and Noble. There is no perfect book out there. So don't stress about that. There's going to be something wrong whenever you finally get your printed copy. But hopefully, if you've done your job hiring all the different stages of editors, the things that are left will just be very minor mistakes. So, but you're never going to catch it all, and that's just the way of the world. So proofreading is the final stages before move-in on your dream house. So it's those paint touch-ups where something scratched the paint on the wall, or, you got to put the light bulbs in those brand new light fixtures, or Swiffer the floors where all that construction dust is everywhere. And that's proofreading. It's those little attention to the minor details that really make your dream house shine. So to recap, the 4 types of editing that every manuscript needs are: number 1, self-editing; number 2, developmental editing; number 3, line editing; and finally, number 4, proofreading. And if you've done all that, you have your final draft, which is, of course, your dream home, your dream manuscript, exactly the way that you envisioned it when you first drew that floor plan. So, of course, that's the process. It's never going to go as smoothly as you anticipate it going, but knowing about those 4 different types of editing going into it can sometimes save you a lot of trouble. The last thing that I just wanted to mention is that there is a difference in this process if you're self-publishing versus traditional publishing. You still need to be aware of it either way. But if you are self-publishing, these 4 types of editing are really, really important, because you are responsible for hiring all editors at all stages. And you're responsible for every period and comma in that final printed book that comes out. So for self-publishers, I really, really, taking control and mastering these 4 levels of editing are essential. If you're going to go traditional publishing, whether you're going to submit to an agent or directly to a publisher, then it may not be as essential to do all 4 types of editing ahead of time. For example, if you have an agent already, or if you are already in talks with a publisher who's interested in your book, they will often serve as your developmental editor, especially. So my agent, for example, if I send her a picture book, she will developmentally edit it for me and send it back to me with that feedback. So in traditional publishing, some of this is going to be done for you. Now, I say that, but at the same time, if you're pursuing traditional publishing, but you're not there yet, so in other words, you're just starting to query agents and you're trying to impress them, or you're going to submit directly to publishers and you're going to try to impress them, then you may want to pay for some of these stages before you submit. And how much you pay for upfront is totally up to you. I have had clients who, pay for tons of editing beforehand, and sometimes that pays off in getting them an agent or a publisher. Sometimes it doesn't. It's a risk, of course, no matter what, but they looked at it as an investment in that manuscript. And then I've had people who didn't hire any editors at all. They did their self-editing as best they could. They had their critique readers, critique partners help them out, and then they went ahead and submitted to agents and got agents that way. So it can work both ways. It's really just up to you how much you want to invest in that ahead of time. And that's it. If you guys do get to the point where you need a developmental or a line editor, I offer those services. You're welcome to get in touch with me at my email address there. And of course, At Home Author is going to continue to offer amazing courses. I'm specifically going to focus on some writing craft courses that may help you in the self-editing process. So definitely subscribe to their page and check back for new courses.